Resurrection Mary is, without a doubt, the most famous ghost in Chicago. But she is only one of a number of so-called vanishing hitchhikers that have been seen in many parts of the world, from England and Scotland to China and Japan, India, South America, for well over 100 years. And our version of the story, our Resurrection Mary, is the most famous of the vanishing hitchhikers, and that is because of her staying power. She has continued to have so many eyewitnesses that have experienced her up until the present day, and that makes her unique among all the vanishing hitchhikers. No one quite is sure who Resurrection Mary was in life. There are a number of versions of the story that attempt to connect the ghost to one or another young women that lived and died in Chicago, usually in the 1920s or 30s. There's a version of the story that talks about little Anna Norkus, who was a 12-year-old girl that died in 1927 on the way home from a dance on the eve of her 12th birthday. She was buried in Resurrection Cemetery, and her ghost is seen traversing Archer Avenue outside late at night. There's a version of the story that connects Resurrection Mary to a girl named Mary Miskowski that was from the Bridgeport neighborhood on the south side that was reportedly killed on her way home from a Halloween party in the 1930s. There are many different versions of the story, but without a doubt, the one that has lasted longest and has convinced so many of its reality is the story of Mary Bergovie. Mary Bergovie was a beautiful young woman, a factory worker in the packing town of the Stockyards district in the back of the yards. She lived on South Damon Avenue, where she worked 6 days a week and went out dancing just about every night. Her favorite place to dance was the old O. Henry Ballroom out on Archer Avenue, today still operating as the Willowbrook Ballroom. She had gone out shopping on a spring afternoon in 1934 with a friend of hers and made a double date with some young men that they had met for later on that night. That night, they went out dancing at the Willowbrook Ballroom, and at the end of the evening, about 1:30 in the morning, when the ballrooms closed, Mary still wanted to dance as usual. So she begged her escort to take them into the city where some of the nightclubs were open later. And so he, of course, complied. They went into the city, they danced till about 4 o'clock in the morning, and then headed out to make their way back to back of the yards. Well, as they were leaving the loop, the car they were driving in got into a deadly accident at the intersection of Lake Street and Wacker Drive. The car struck one of the support beams of the Lake Street elevated train structure. Mary was sitting in the front passenger seat and went through the window and died on the way to the hospital. She was buried at Resurrection Cemetery a few days later, and a few days after the burial, visitors to the cemetery began to report to the cemetery management that they were seeing a young woman dressed in a party dress with no shoes on, wandering around that section of the cemetery where Mary had been recently buried. When we hear about ghost stories, we usually hear about someone seeing a wispy form across the room or a shadowy figure in the corner. The stories of Resurrection Mary are never of that nature. Whenever someone encounters her, she is as real as can be. Men who'd never met Mary Bergovie were reporting that they had danced with this beautiful stranger who they had met on the ballroom floor, who seemed cold to the touch when they danced with her. She didn't have much to say. She was a woman of few words, but at the end of the evening, she would beg for a ride home. The young man was always happy to comply, but he could only get her so far. As they passed the gates of Resurrection Cemetery, driving home on Archer Road, she would either simply vanish from the car or throw the car door open and run into the darkness, disappearing right through the cemetery fence and into the darkness of the cemetery beyond. One of the most famous encounters with Resurrection Mary, there was a man that was driving past the cemetery. He was distracted by some movement towards the cemetery gate. And as he looked, he saw that there was a young woman that was trapped inside the cemetery. And she was standing at the front gates, clutching the bars, looking very much afraid. The man figured that she had been locked inside the cemetery after closing time. It's an enormous place. He turned around in his car and went back to the police station and reported what he had seen. And the police officer at the desk called the caretaker of Resurrection to meet two officers at the front gates to let the young woman out and make sure she was okay. They met the caretaker at the front gates a few minutes later and found no trace of anyone there. But what they did find was that the bars that the young woman had been clutching had been pried apart as if by some incredible heat, and burned into the metal were the imprint of two, what were described later as delicate hands. I met people who came in the weeks that followed to look at the bars that they believed had been bent by Resurrection Mary. And I've been told by many people that saw the bars firsthand before they were repaired that the imprints of the fingerprints were so precise that you could actually see the fingerprints burned into the metal of the bars. The cemetery said that there had been an accident. A cemetery worker had backed a truck into the bars, they said, and bent them. So they had heated them up, and a worker had put on some heavy worker's gloves and had tried to bend the bars back into shape, which they said explained the handprints on the bars. Many, many eyewitnesses who came to see the bars in the weeks that followed went on record saying that the handprints that they saw were the handprints of a child. I think that kind of the magic or the dynamo behind the Resurrection Mary encounters is really the road itself. Archer Avenue was an ancient Indian road, and we know from talking with Native Americans all around the United States that these ancient roads were laid down by their ancestors over lines in the environment that they believed to have spiritual significance. And they were traditionally, and apparently continue to be, places where people have supernatural experiences. We do special Archer Avenue tours about quarterly, where we go down. Specifically, we start out at Chet's Melody Lounge across from Resurrection Cemetery, which is very famously associated with the story. Resurrection Mary has gone into Chet's Melody Lounge on several occasions. She was taken there once by a cab driver.
Wait here, please.
She went inside to get the cab fare to give him his payment, and she never came out. He went in rather angrily to find her.
Excuse me.
No one had come into the bar all night long. And since that night, they always leave a Bloody Mary at the end of the bar in case she comes in. There's a very, very strong movement to not talk about her, to not talk about Resurrection Mary, and to not even acknowledge that she exists. But there have been, again, so many eyewitnesses testifying to the reality of her that she will not be dismissed.